Great light to all, and to all a great light. This is David, a man of passion, chapter 5, aftermath of a giant killing. When was the last time you thanked the Lord for not showing you the future? I'm convinced that one of the best things God does for us is keep us from knowing what will happen beyond today. Just think of all the stuff you didn't have to worry about just because you never knew it was coming your way. It's true, God never changes, but we certainly do. The places we live change, people change, even friends change, jobs change. Or how about your home? Things change there too. Children are conceived unexpectedly. Many parents are brokenhearted because their older children are not walking with God. Others are sorrowing because death has taken a parent or a son or daughter. Our health changes. Or how about tests in life? Just think of what has happened in the past 5 years. Aren't you glad God didn't tell you about all those things 5 years ago? Aren't you glad He didn't give you your life ahead of time on credit? Instead, we just take life one day at a time. That's the way He dispenses life because He never changes and He knows what will work together for good. You and I don't. We sort of ricochet from one moment to the next, trying to put together what life is all about. And when often, we often don't have the time or wisdom to figure it out. God is good, not to show us tomorrow. That's what makes the Bible so relevant. The same was true in ancient times while His word was being lived out and recorded. How gracious of God to give David one day at a time. I wonder how many people think that David, after he killed the giant within a matter of just a few days, took the throne and became the youngest king in the history of Israel. Well, in case you were one who thought that, you need to know it didn't happen that way. As a matter of fact, the aftermath of the giant kill led David into one of the deepest, longest, and darkest valleys of his entire life. This young man, who had proved himself faithful among the sheep and on the battlefield, went from the highest pinnacle of popularity to the lowest depression of despair. God was good not to tell David all that was coming his way. Review: a giant slain. As we saw in the previous chapter, David had just accomplished an incredible thing, a remarkable achievement. A young man, not yet 20 years old, who had never worn the uniform of the Israeli army, never once suited up for battle, never once known what it was to carry a sword, had run out onto the battlefield, faced a giant almost 10 feet tall, and killed him with one throw of his sling. As a result, David gained instant popularity. He became a national hero. The people began to sing his praises. Saul made good on his promise to enrich the man who killed Goliath. David became a permanent part of the king's court. David became an overnight celebrity. Very few people could take all that in stride, but David did. He knew how to live with success without having it affect him. It's rare, it's a rare person who can do that, especially if he is young and has never lived his life before the public. Relationships, 4 different experiences. At this point, David's life unfolds into 4 different relationships: a relationship of submission with Saul, a relationship of affection with Saul's son, Jonathan, a relationship of elevation or exaltation with the people of Israel, and a relationship of position with Saul that lasted year after year after year. God's hand was on David. Ultimately, the Lord was going to use him as the greatest king in the history of Israel. But in order to do that, he had to break him and hone him and sharpen him, which included crushing him. David was about to enter the crucible of pain. Thankfully, he had no idea how excruciating the pain would be. The first thing that happened was that Saul would not let David return to his sheep. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. So David went wherever Saul sent him. 1 Samuel 18, 2, 5. Here is the champion of champions, the slayer of the giant, and he went wherever Saul sent him. He was in loyal submission to his king. He served as sort of an intern incognito, a king in the making, without Saul's realizing it. And what happened? He prospered. 4 times in the same chapter, it says David prospered, or that he behaved himself wisely. What a man. He simply did what God led him to do. He submitted to authority, and God lifted him up above his peers. Meanwhile, standing in the shadows, as David stood before the king, was another young man, Jonathan, the son of a king, or King Saul. Apparently, these two young men had not met until this moment, but immediately their lives were knitted together. 1 Samuel 18, 1, 3. It came about when he, David, had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. God knew that David needed an intimate friend to walk with him through the valley that was ahead of him. Intimate friends are rare in life. Often we have only one, occasionally two, usually not more than 3 in our entire lives. There's something about an intimate friend that causes your souls to be knit together. It's what we call a kindred spirit. Intimate friendship has 4 characteristics, and we find all of them in this story. First, an intimate friend is willing to sacrifice. You don't have to beg a close friend for a favor, which was certainly the case with Jonathan. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. 1 Samuel 18:4. He wanted to give David something that belonged to him and was meaningful to him. Friends do that. They're never stingy with their possessions later. Jonathan says to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." That's the word of an intimate friend. You can hardly impose on an intimate friend. He doesn't keep score. An intimate friend is there to assist whenever and whatever way is needed. Unselfishness prevails. Second, an intimate friend is a loyal defense before others. He's not a fair weather friend. He won't talk against you when you're not around. It says Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father. That was very significant because Saul was not only the king and Jonathan's father, but also by that time Saul had determined to be David's enemy. Yet Jonathan stood up to his father and said, "Dad, you're wrong about David." In fact, he not only defended his friend, he also rebuked his father for his attitude toward David. 1 Samuel 19, 4 through 5. Jonathan said to him, "Saul, do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause?" What a friend Jonathan was. No pettiness, no envy, no jealousy. After all, Jonathan, as Saul's son, might have been the heir apparent. He might have wanted the praise of the people, yet here was this kid from the hills of Bethlehem garnering all of it. Still, Jonathan stood in defense of his friend against his own father, who was ready to take David's life. This is what we might call bottom line theology. This is putting shoe leather to your belief, to your faith. He stood in his defense. because he was his friend. Third, intimate friends give each other complete freedom to be themselves. When you've got a friend this close, this knitted to your own soul, you don't have to explain why you do what you do. You just do it. David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept together for David more. 1 Samuel 20:41. When your heart is broken, you can bleed all over a friend like this, and he will understand. He won't confront you in your misery or share with you 3 verses, then tell you to straighten up. When a good friend is hurting, let him hurt. If a good friend feels like weeping, let him weep. If a good friend needs to complain, listen. An intimate friend doesn't bail. He's right there with you. You can be yourself no matter what that self looks like. And finally, an intimate friend is a constant source of encouragement. Now, David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in God. 1 Samuel 23:15-16. Think of that. There was a hit man after David, and his name was Saul, Jonathan's father. David was out of the wilderness, and at any moment, behind any bush or rock or hill, Saul and his men might have been waiting to strike him down. The murderous hatred of Saul haunted David's life. And what does the son of this hit man do? He encourages his friend. Wow, that's the kind of friend to have. He sees David at the lowest moment of his life, frightened, beleaguered, stumbling through the wilderness, and he brings him encouragement. I understand how that feels. You have every right to have those feelings. There'll be brighter day someday, but right now I'm here with you, no matter what. Someone has said, loneliness is the most desperate of all English words. Even Jesus surrounded himself with friends. I think it is shameful that some have tarnished this beautiful story by trying to claim that the friendship between David and Jonathan provides a biblical bias for homosexuality. It was a true, deep friendship that transcended the circumstances in which both men found themselves. It was a wholesome, God honoring relationship that God used in the lives of both men and even in the future lives of their families. As the plot thickens, we come to the third relationship in David's life, the relationship of elevation or exaltation with the people of Israel. 1 Samuel 18:5. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servant. David had never served in the army, let alone been in any official role of leadership, but now he commended the troops, and he did it so well that even the king's servants were impressed. Despite his youth and inexperience, David knew how to conduct himself with everyone. The servants liked him, the troops liked him, and even Saul, when he was not in the grip of his evil spirit, respected him. When David returned from killing the Philistine, the woman came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. And the woman sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. 1 Samuel 18:6-7. They were singing and dancing in the streets, welcoming and honoring this young man who had defended the name of their God. If there is a single statement that best describes David at this time in his life, it would be this one. 1 Samuel 18:14. And David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. As I mentioned earlier, it says he prospered 4 times in this chapter. That interested me. So I looked up the Hebrew word, sakal, from which prospered is derived. I discovered Two insightful things about that term. Proverbs 10:19 reveals the first. When there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Saul. A person who is wise, who prospers, knows how to keep his mouth shut. He can keep confidence when people say, look, don't share that. That's another characteristic of a good friend, by the way. A good friend can be trusted with the details of your life. He keeps his mouth closed. Furthermore, when he opens his mouth, he opens it with discretion. That's a sign of a so-called person. That was David. And the second insight is in Proverbs 21:11. When the scoffer is punished, the naive becomes wise. But when the wise is instructed, Sakal, he receives knowledge. The Sakal or Sakal person is teachable. That's the kind of man David was. He was wise because he guarded his lips and he kept a teachable spirit, no matter how fast the promotion or how high the exaltation may be. We are never to lose our teachability. We never reach a level where we are above criticism or we no longer need the input of others. And frankly, there are times when our best lessons can be learned from our enemies. That leads us to David's fourth relationship, which was one of opposition with Saul. Keep in mind that David had done nothing to deserve the treatment Saul gave him. He was a Saul man. His motives were right. His actions were right. His leadership was right, but Saul's jealousy got in the way. Then Saul became very angry. For this saying, the praises the women were singing about David displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now, what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. 1 Samuel 18:8-9. 1 Samuel 18:8 says that Saul became very angry. The Hebrew word translated angry is vivid. Chara means to burn within. We would say Saul did a slow burn, but this saying displeased him. The Hebrew word here means inner turmoil. His stomach turned. As Saul did a slow burn, his stomach sort of ripped him. Then, as fear and worry intensified, Saul became paranoid. What more can he have now but the kingdom? His self-talk lost control. Hey, I've got a problem on my hands. I got a giant killer who's going to become a king killer. What am I going to do about that? He's afraid of his own shadow. That's Saul. Within a matter of minutes, he looked at David with suspicion from that day on. When imagination is fueled by jealousy, suspicion takes over. And at that point, dangerous things occur. David had done nothing to deserve that kind of treatment. He had served God, killed a giant, submitted himself to his superior, and behaved properly. In fact, verse 15 says, when Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. Why? Because Saul saw that God was on David's side, and he realized that he himself didn't have that kind of power. It was more than he could handle. The Bible is so practical, isn't it? Jealousy is a deadly sin, and the suspicion of Saul shackled him in its prison because he operated in that tight radius of fear, worry, and paranoia. Saul's great goal in life became twisted. Instead of leading Israel onto bigger and better things, he focused on making David's life miserable. And as we shall see in the next several chapters, Saul's madness causes him to lose sight of all wholesome and responsible objectives, as David, the object of his jealousy, lives like a fugitive for years. How gracious of God not to reveal to David the pain of those tragic years. With that, we leave him for now and glean at least 3 relevant applications for today. Relevance, our lives today. First, not knowing the future forces us to take one day at a time. That's the sum and substance of the life of faith. As Jesus taught, each day has enough trouble of its own. Matthew 6:34. Second, having an intimate friends helps us face whatever comes our way. If you don't have a friend, ask God to give you one. Someone you can relate to and who will be a source of encouragement and support. Third, being positive and wise is the best reaction to an enemy. When you see your enemy coming, don't roll up your mental sleeves, deceiving with jab. You will throw. Remember how David handled Saul. David just kept prospering, just kept behaving himself wisely, and when the heat rose, he fled the scene. He refused to fight back or get even. So if you are rubbing shoulders with a jealous individual, whether it be a roommate, a boss, a friend, or even a mate, remember the motto of David. Living for Christ is the most exciting adventure in the world, but it's hard, G.K. Chesterfield said. The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. It's a lot easier to put your enemy's lights out, to devise ways to fight back, to get even, because that satisfies your flesh. It's a lot easier to keep than to give, because that comes naturally. It's a lot easier to work up your own suspicion, and when he's not looking, won't get in your stroke. But that's not God's way, and that's not best. It boils down to this: walking in victory is the difference between what pleases us and what pleases God. Like David, we need to stand fast to do what is right without tiring of it. Plain and simple. That what pleases God. And in the final analysis, that's why we're left on the earth, isn't it? Amen. You all have a great light. I enjoy reading this to you, and I will continue on as I continue on. Much love to you all. Great light.